ago and wrote about on my website, on my Mormonism research site, is the possibility concerning the origins and the history of the Book of Abraham. The book may have had its origin as a Semitic text. There's no question about that, I don't think. But it experienced a normal transmission, just as all ancient texts have, of the process of copying, translation, and redaction from the time of Abraham in the Middle Bronze Age until down to 100 BC to 100 AD in the Greco-Roman era, when the Egyptian papyrus copies were made. The theme is, we understand Abraham may very well have written an original book about his experiences in Egypt. Then he died, and his book was handed down through the ages, and later Jews copied it, they transmitted it from each other, and they redacted it. They put their own information into this book. Yet, for all of that, it is still the Book of Abraham, even though he may have never touched these papyri that we now possess. It still has significant factors about his life. This is an intriguing idea. What this ultimately suggests is that Abraham may not have drawn the actual facsimiles in the Book of Abraham at all. Now this is an important point. It says this on page 108. It says, these may have been Egyptian religious vignettes that were adopted or adapted by an Egyptian Jewish redactor as illustrations for a genuine Book of Abraham that that person had in his possession. In order to illustrate it, he took actual Egyptian illustrations from the Egyptian Book of the Dead or the Egyptian Book of Breathings, wherever the Egyptian Jew got it from, and put it with the Book of Abraham, rather than Abraham actually having drawn these facsimiles himself. Because the dating of the papyri is much too late. So now the question becomes, this is an interesting hypothesis, is there anything to substantiate the fact that Egyptian Jews or any other kind of Jewish person, would they literally bring in foreign materials into their own materials? Would they redact it? Would they add to it? And would they use a foreign material to illustrate their scriptures? And the absolute breathtaking answer is yes, they did that. Kevin brings out 3 illustrations that show this very interesting and peculiar Jewish theme, because the Joseph Smith Papyri date from the Greco-Roman period. And it's so fascinating that it is precisely in this Greco-Roman period that we have these 3 examples of Jews illustrating their scriptures from Egyptian materials of all things. It is a very intriguing hypothesis here. The Greco-Roman period, of course, being in the era from 100 BC to 100 AD, and this is apparently the time of serious scribal and redactional activity of various Jews or groups of Jews in their particular situations who had scriptures that they were using Egyptian materials to incorporate into their scriptures because it helped them get the message across. We will suggest that such Jewish adaptation of Egyptian sources was common during this time period and would explain the adaptation of the facsimiles to illustrate a Book of Abraham, which may come under this redactor's care as part of the ancient transmission of the text. We have fascinating historical precedents for just this maneuver by the ancient Jews in the Greco-Roman period. This is so fascinating. Anyway, the Spalding pamphlet, they discussed the various problems with the papyri. They said it was an original autograph of the Book of Abraham that Joseph Smith possessed, and the early brethren may have got carried away in some of their descriptions about that, but it's nothing of the sort. It is a late, genuine Egyptian papyri and papyrus that these materials were written on, but it certainly wasn't in Abraham's possession. They said the papyri from which the facsimiles were part and parcel of with the Book of Abraham and similar were also autographical documents. Abraham himself drew these facsimiles. That's what they said in 1912, and that's simply not true either. Since all of these papyri were written by Abraham himself, of course, it necessarily follows that Abraham originally composed them in the Egyptian language. That was another assumption that the 1912 affair was completely incorrect with. And as purely Egyptian documents, the facsimiles could properly be tested without any reference at all to the Book of Abraham with which they purport to be related to. These are the autographic assumptions that they labored in 1912 under. And every one of these assumptions have now, through subsequent studies and research, been shown to be false. So those who use the 1912 situation to beat up the Book of Abraham with, it's an outdated theme at this point from the 1912 point of view. We've come a long way. A lot of water has gone under the bridge as far as our researching into the Book of Abraham. We've had Hugh Nibley, and we've had H. Donald Peterson. We now have John Gee, myself. We have Kevin Barney. We have Brian Hauglid. We have William Shriver. There's a lot of LDS scholars who are beginning to look into this Book of Abraham material, and so we have to let some things go. Now, the critics, as a general tenor, want to keep the Book of Abraham situation with the relationship of the Book of Abraham with the Joseph Smith Papyri. They want to keep it in the 1967 groove, the year when some of the fragments of the papyri were given back to the church. Aziz Atiya, a Coptic Egyptian scholar, found those in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and he somehow got them back to the church eventually, and proceeded to give them to N. Eldon Tanner. I mean, there was a big spiel about it in the Improvement era. And the church promptly published sepia tones of the photographs and all that. And then Hugh Nibley basically took it up from there, and then other various scholars have been studying them ever since then. The actual color photographs are magnificently reproduced in the second edition of Hugh Nibley's Message of the Joseph Smith Papyri, but those color photographs are also coming out in another edition, I believe, by Brian Hauglid and John Gee. Oh, and Michael Dennis Rhodes is another very good Egyptologist and LDS scholar who have been studying the papyri. So we're developing new grounds. And the assumptions from the 1912 situation are all old, and they're all outdated. Many of the assumptions from the 1967 era that is typical of anti-Mormon arguments are also outdated and old. They love to crow about it, though. They love to say we're hiding from the truth. And they love to say we don't understand the relationship of the papyri to the Book of Abraham. But we have some very intriguing possibilities that just aren't being refuted so far as I can see in my reading and study in this subject. Kevin Barney's new theme is one of these that is especially intriguing. It's very interesting how the assumptions of the original language that the Book of Abraham was in was discussed by John A. Whitstone. And he pithily asked, who says, or who has said, that Abraham wrote the book in Egyptian anyway? That's an assumption. We don't have any evidence of that. Since the papyri themselves were written in Egyptian, that is certainly one of the languages we must consider, of course. But if they weren't autographical documents, then the Egyptian language has absolutely nothing to do with the original language that Abraham wrote his book in. Very interesting. When a previously unknown book from antiquity is discovered, scholars don't simply assume that the book was originally composed in the language in which the book happens to exist in. That's utterly ludicrous. That's extremely naive. That was the problem with the 1912 scholars. They assumed it was all in Egyptian, the Book of Abraham itself. They do not, for instance, assume that the Apocalypse of Abraham was composed in Old Slavonic just because that's the language in which the Apocalypse of Abraham is preserved. It's